Ethan Ward had lived alone on his ranch for so many years that even the land seemed to forget the sound of another human voice. His nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away, and the nearest town was even farther. Most days, Ethan spoke only to his horses, the cattle, and the quiet wind that slid across the wide prairie. It was a lonely life, but it was the only one he knew. Every morning he woke before sunrise, saddled his horse, checked the water lines, and rode across the rolling land he cared for with stubborn loyalty. Even though he rarely talked to anyone, he had a gentle heart, something most people in town never realized. To them, he was only the quiet rancher who bought supplies and left without a word. But out here, away from crowds and noise, his silence was almost a kind of peace. That peace changed one warm afternoon. Ethan was riding back from the far end of his property when he heard a strange sound, a faint cry carried through the wind. He paused, listening, thinking at first it might be an injured calf, but the sound was too sharp, too human. He frowned, glanced around the empty landscape, and urged his horse toward the noise. The dry riverbed lay ahead, filled with broken rocks and desert shrubs. As he got closer, he heard voices, 2 women speaking quickly in Apache, their tones filled with worry. Ethan slowed his horse. He knew enough about the land to understand that Apache families sometimes traveled through this region, but he had never spoken to any of them. He had always kept a respectful distance. Still, he could tell something was wrong. He rode to a higher rock ledge and looked down into the riverbed. What he saw made him straighten in his saddle. 2 Apache women were struggling to pull a horse out from a narrow split in the ground. The animal was trapped between sharp stones, kicking weakly as it tried to free itself. Dust rose around its legs, and its breathing was rough and frightened. The women were doing everything they could, pulling ropes, pushing rocks aside, but the animal wasn't moving much. One of the women cried out in frustration, wiping sweat from her face. Before Ethan could call down to them, the younger woman glanced up and froze. Her eyes widened when she saw him sitting on his horse above them. A flash of fear crossed her face, and she shouted, "Don't move, cowboy!" Her voice echoed so sharply between the rocks that even his horse twitched. Ethan raised his hands slightly, showing he meant no harm. But he did not back away. The older woman turned too, her expression filled with alarm, and she repeated the warning. "Don't move." Ethan blinked, surprised by the urgency in their voices. They weren't holding weapons. They weren't acting as if he was a threat. No, their fear was pointed somewhere else. Something near them, or above them, was dangerous. Ethan scanned the cliffs around the cracked riverbed, and then finally understood. A large slab of rock hung loosely above the women. A thin crack ran through it, and small bits of stone had already fallen onto the ground. If anyone stepped wrong, shouted loudly, or shook the ground too much, that heavy rock could collapse right on top of them. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He understood immediately why they had yelled at him. These women weren't trying to scare him away, they were trying to protect him. From up high, where his horse stood, even a small vibration could send the fragile shelf of stone crashing down. And if that happened, it wouldn't only crush the horse, it could bury the women too. He nodded slowly to show he understood, then quietly dismounted. The women exchanged quick looks. They had warned him, but he was still moving toward them. Ethan moved carefully, choosing soft soil instead of stones, so he wouldn't send vibrations down the slope. When he got close enough to speak without shouting, he said in a calm voice, "I want to help." The older woman shook her head. She pointed up at the cracked stone shelf, and then at the trapped horse. "Danger," she said. "Too risky." Ethan looked at the trembling horse. The animal's legs were bleeding where sharp rocks had cut into them. The creature was exhausted, and its breathing came in short bursts, each one weaker than the last. If someone didn't help soon, the horse might not survive the hour. He stepped a little closer. The ground shifted slightly, and small stones tumbled down the slope. Both women gasped softly. The younger one whispered something to her companion, clearly frightened for him, perhaps even for all of them. Ethan didn't respond to their fear. He simply looked at the animal again and said, "If we wait too long, it won't make it." Something in his calm tone made the women stop arguing. The older one stared at him for a long moment, her expression torn between doubt and hope. Finally, she stepped aside, allowing him closer to the trapped horse. Ethan lowered himself to the ground on his hands and knees, crawling forward slowly so every movement was controlled and quiet. Dust clung to his face, and the sunlight reflected off the rocks, making the air shimmer with heat. The horse saw him approaching and thrashed weakly, terrified. Ethan murmured softly, almost whispering, using the same gentle voice he used for frightened cattle during storms. His words weren't important, it was the calm sound that mattered. The animal gradually stopped fighting and stared at him with wide, panicked eyes. The narrow space was tight, and Ethan could barely fit. Sharp stones dug into his boots and scraped his arms. He sucked in a breath and studied the way the horse was wedged. It had slipped sideways, trapping its hind leg between two jagged rocks. Pulling it forward would require leverage and steady strength, not sudden force. He glanced back at the women and motioned for his rope. They handed it to him cautiously, watching every move he made. Ethan looped the rope around the horse's chest and front legs, tying it in a way that would lift the animal forward without twisting its injured leg. He double-checked the knot twice. Only when he felt sure did he call the women forward to take hold of the rope's end. With the three of them working, the rope tightened. The horse cried out softly, and Ethan pressed a hand to its neck, whispering again. When the women pulled, the rock shelf above them gave a small crack, sending pebbles raining down. The younger woman flinched and looked up fearfully. But Ethan kept steady. He told them to pull slow, not fast. They followed his instructions, each pull steady and even. The horse's body scraped forward an inch, then another, then a little more. Dust clouded the air, sweat dripped down Ethan's forehead. The women's hands shook from effort, but they didn't stop. The horse's trapped leg finally slipped free with a sharp jerk. The animal stumbled out of the crack and fell onto its side, panting heavily but alive. The younger woman sank to her knees, covering her face with her hands, overwhelmed with relief. The older woman let out a long breath, something like gratitude mixed with disbelief, and then looked at Ethan. For the first time since he arrived, her eyes softened. Ethan wiped his dusty hands on his jeans and stood slowly. He had barely risen to his feet when the rock shelf above them made one last groaning sound. Ethan grabbed the women's arms and pulled them back a few steps just before a chunk of stone dropped where they had been standing. The three of them stared at the broken pieces on the ground. No one spoke. The danger had been real seconds earlier. It could have crushed all of them. The older woman finally whispered, "You should have stayed away. But thank you." To have a honor, Ethan gave a small nod. He wasn't used to people thanking him. He wasn't used to speaking much at all. But at that moment, the silence between them wasn't lonely, it felt shared, almost peaceful. His quiet life, the empty ranch, the long days alone, none of that felt important right now. What mattered was that he had been in the right place at the right time. What mattered was that he hadn't turned away. The Apache women stood for a moment in silence, still catching their breath after the horse had been pulled free. Dust clung to their clothes, and their hands were shaking from the effort. The younger woman touched the freed horse gently, whispering something soft in her language, her voice trembling with relief. Ethan watched them quietly, brushing dirt from his sleeve, not wanting to interrupt their moment. He could see how much the animal meant to them. Its safety felt almost like a family member being rescued, but the danger around them wasn't completely gone. The loose stones above still shifted now and then with a dry crack, reminding them that the riverbed was not a safe place to linger. The older woman glanced up at the cliff wall again, her face tense, and then looked at Ethan. She gave a small nod, a silent signal that they should all move away from the unsettled rocks. Ethan agreed and stepped aside, motioning for the women to lead the horse to safer ground. The injured animal limped but managed to stand, leaning against the younger woman for balance. The three of them moved together toward the open stretch of sand, where the danger was less. When they finally reached a flatter area, the women let out a long breath, as if they had been holding it inside their chests for too long. The older woman turned to Ethan. Her eyes studied him with a mix of caution and curiosity. Earlier, she had shouted at him to stay away, worried for his life and maybe worried about who he might be. Now, the way she looked at him had changed. There was still caution, but there was respect too. She spoke first, her words simple. "You helped, even when we told you not to." Ethan shrugged lightly, as if what he had done was nothing special. "The horse needed help," he said. "Anyone would have done the same." The younger woman shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "Not anyone." Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not from strangers. He had spent most of his life doing small acts of kindness alone, not for praise but because he didn't know how to walk away from someone in trouble. Even when the world ignored him, he couldn't ignore others. As he shifted his weight, a sharp sting shot up his arm. He winced before he could stop himself. The older woman noticed immediately. "You're hurt," she said, stepping closer. Ethan tried to hide the scrape on his forearm, brushing away the blood as if it was nothing. "It's only a scratch." But the older woman wasn't convinced. She reached into the leather pouch at her waist and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were dried leaves, a small piece of bark, and what looked like crushed herbs. Ethan watched her carefully, not wanting to appear rude but unsure what she planned to do. She motioned for him to sit. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to anyone taking care of him. For years, he had patched up his own cuts and bruises, cooked his own meals, stitched his own clothes. He lived alone because he didn't know how to live any other way. Letting someone fuss over him felt strange. The younger woman noticed his hesitation and gave him a soft smile, as if trying to put him at ease. "She knows healing," she said. "Let her help." Ethan finally sat on a nearby rock, and the older woman knelt beside him. She crushed the herbs in her hand and pressed them gently onto his wound. It stung at first, and he had to fight the urge to pull away. But then, the pain faded, replaced by a coolness that eased the throbbing. "You were brave," the younger woman said. "But you took a risk for us. We must help you too." Ethan looked down at his arm, now wrapped neatly in a strip of cloth the older woman tied with careful fingers. Something about the gesture was unexpected. It had been so long since someone had cared about whether he was hurt or not. The simple act touched him more than he wanted to admit. "Thank you," he said quietly. The women exchanged a glance, surprised by how gentle his voice was. Many cowboys they had met spoke loudly or acted boldly. But Ethan spoke like someone who didn't want to disturb the quiet around him. They sat together for a moment, catching their breath, letting the dust settle around them. The younger woman eventually broke the silence. "We feared you," she admitted. "There have been dangerous men in this land. Men who hurt our people, take what is ours, and leave us hiding in fear. When we saw a cowboy riding toward us, we didn't know if you were one of them." Ethan listened attentively. He didn't interrupt or make excuses. He simply let them speak, quietly absorbing every word. The older woman continued. "Our tribe has been avoiding all strangers these past weeks. The men who came through our land, they brought trouble. So when we saw you, we warned you not to move because we feared what you might do, and also feared what the rocks might do to you." Ethan nodded slowly. "I understand why you were afraid." He didn't take offense. Fear made people cautious, and caution had probably kept them alive. The younger woman's gaze softened. "But then you helped us. You went into danger without asking for anything." Ethan looked at the injured horse again. "Sometimes helping is the only right choice," he said. As he spoke, he stood and tested his arm, making sure the bandage was tight. The older woman watched him and asked gently, "Why were you riding alone today? Where is your family?" Ethan paused. He wasn't used to people asking personal questions. He looked toward the horizon, where his ranch lay hidden beyond rolling fields. "I live alone," he said simply. "Have for many years." The women waited, sensing there was more. "I had family once," he added, "but they're gone now. The ranch is all I have left. So I keep working, keep moving. Some days I feel needed. Some days, I just exist." The younger woman nodded slowly, understanding more than he expected. Life on the land taught everyone something about loss. She placed a hand softly on the horse's neck. "We understand loneliness," she said. "Our tribe moves and changes. Sometimes people disappear from our lives too." The honesty in her voice didn't feel heavy, it felt shared, like a truth spoken in calm acceptance. The older woman suddenly stiffened slightly, as if remembering something urgent. She exchanged a quick glance with her companion, and the younger woman's face grew tense again. Ethan noticed instantly. "What's wrong?" The older woman looked at him with a serious expression. "The dangerous men we spoke of. They took something from our village before they left. Something important. Sacred to us." Ethan frowned. "What did they take?" "A chest of medicines," the younger woman replied. "Herbs, cures, things our healer needs. Without them, many in our tribe will suffer." Ethan felt the weight of their worry. "Where did the men go?" The older woman pointed west, toward the land beyond Ethan's ranch. "Their tracks lead near your home. We believe they camped somewhere close." 2. Ethan absorbed this in silence. He hadn't expected the day to lead him into anyone's troubles. He had only wanted to help a trapped horse, yet here he stood, listening to a story that pulled him deeper into a conflict he had never known existed. The women watched him anxiously. They didn't ask for help, not yet. They didn't know if he would offer it. They only waited, hope flickering like a small flame behind their eyes. Ethan looked at their injured horse, at their tired faces, and then at the distant land where dangerous men might be hiding. He felt something stir inside him, something he thought he had lost long ago. "Purpose. You helped me," he said softly, raising his wrapped arm. "Let me help you too." The women stared at him, surprised. No stranger had ever offered them something so freely, without fear or hesitation. The older woman finally nodded, her voice quieter than before. "If you choose to help, we will not forget." Ethan gave a small, determined smile. "Then let's not waste time." The sun was already lowering, and trouble waited somewhere near his home. But he no longer felt alone. And he wasn't about to let their sacred medicines stay in the hands of dangerous men. After Ethan offered his help, the tone between him and the Apache women shifted. A moment earlier, they had seen him as a stranger, someone who could be a danger or a misunderstanding waiting to happen. But now, they saw something steady in him, something dependable. The older woman nodded in quiet acceptance, and the younger one gave him a look filled with cautious hope, as if she wanted to believe he truly meant what he said. The injured horse stood weakly beside them, still trembling but no longer in immediate danger. The younger woman stroked its neck gently. Ethan knew the animal would need rest and water soon, but there was no time to take it back to their village. The chest of medicines was missing, and the longer it stayed gone, the more their people risked suffering. Ethan checked the sky. The sun was lowering, casting long shadows across the ground. Evening would come quickly, and traveling in the dark in this rocky region could lead to more accidents. They needed to work fast but carefully. "We follow the tracks," Ethan said quietly. The older woman pointed in the direction she believed the men had gone, but Ethan waved her closer to inspect the ground together. He knelt and studied the dirt, where hoofprints pressed into the soil. Some were deep, showing where horses had been tied or struggled. Others were lighter, fresh enough to confirm the men had passed through not long ago. Ethan brushed his fingers across one print. "These were made today," he said, "maybe only a few hours ahead of us." The women exchanged a worried glance. The younger one whispered, "If we do not find the chest soon, our healer will not have what she needs tonight. Sick children, old ones, they depend on what was taken." Ethan felt the pressure in their voices. He had lived most of his life solving problems alone. But this situation was different. If they failed, an entire community would suffer, and he suddenly felt responsible, not because he owed them anything, but because he knew he could not walk away. He motioned for them to follow, and started walking along the path the men had taken. The ground was uneven. filled with thorn bushes and dry grass that crackled beneath their feet. Ethan moved with quiet precision, studying every branch, every stone, every sign that the men might have passed through here. The Apache women walked behind him, alert but trusting his judgment in this foreign terrain. As they moved farther from the riverbed, the younger woman finally spoke again. "Your arm. Does it hurt?" Ethan looked down at the bandage she had helped tie earlier. "It's fine," he said, though it still burned slightly. He didn't want them worrying about him. The mission was too important. She seemed unsure whether to believe him, but she didn't press the matter. Ethan appreciated her concern, though he wasn't used to anyone worrying about his well-being. It reminded him how long he had lived without companionship. After a while, the land opened into a flatter stretch, where the wind carried dust across the ground like thin waves. Ethan stopped suddenly and held out his hand. The women froze behind him. He crouched and touched the earth. A piece of torn cloth lay half-buried near a rock. The younger woman gasped softly. "That is ours," she said, recognizing the pattern of their tribe's weaving. Ethan examined it. The cloth was torn recently, likely when one of the men shoved the medicine chest onto his horse. The fact that it fell here meant they were definitely on the right path. He handed the cloth back to the woman, who held it close as if it were a painful reminder of what had been taken. They continued moving west until the terrain became rougher, with broken hills rising on either side. It reminded Ethan of the edge of his own ranch territory. He had ridden through these hills often enough to know they provided perfect hiding spots, sheltered, quiet, and out of sight from anyone traveling on the open plains. "They're close," Ethan whispered. The older woman looked at him, eyes filled with tension. "Will you face them alone?" Ethan shook his head. "No one faces danger alone if I can help it." He studied the hills, noting how the shadows gathered in certain cracks and crevices. The men could be camped just behind one of the ridges, using the land as a shield. The women waited, trusting Ethan's instincts. As they continued forward, the sun hung just above the hills, casting orange light that made every rock seem sharper, every shadow darker. Ethan walked carefully, stepping on softer ground to avoid making noise. The women followed his lead, moving like silent figures of the land. Finally, Ethan raised his hand again, signaling them to stop. He lowered himself behind a cluster of scrub bushes. The Apache women crouched beside him. They peered over the bushes and saw it thin smoke rising behind a small ridge, almost invisible unless someone was truly searching. The older woman's breath caught. "Their camp," Ethan nodded. "We need to find where they kept the chest before they move again." He looked at the terrain. Charging in was not an option. They were outnumbered, unarmed, and unprepared for a direct fight. But Ethan never relied on brute force. He relied on the land, on using the environment the way a rancher learned to do over years of riding alone. "We stay low," he whispered. "We move around the far side of the ridge. The wind will cover our footsteps from that direction." The women followed him as he circled the ridge's outer curve. They moved slowly, using boulders for cover. When they reached a point where they could see the camp clearly, they stopped and watched. 3 men were gathered around a small fire. They looked dirty, tired, and impatient. One of them kicked at the ground as he argued with another. The third man rummaged through a pile of stolen goods, sacks of grain, tools, blankets, and then, finally, the medicine chest. The younger woman's eyes widened. "There," she whispered, pointing. The chest was tied shut but intact. Ethan studied the camp. The men seemed careless, not expecting anyone to track them this far. Their horses were tied loosely to a tree. One of the men was distracted trying to fix a broken saddle strap. Another was yelling at him, clearly annoyed. Ethan leaned closer to the women. "We need a distraction," he said. He thought for a moment. Then the plan formed in his mind, simple, quick, and risky. He moved around to where the men's horses were tied. He didn't get too close, but he positioned himself behind a cluster of rocks. Then he picked up a small stone and tossed it into the brush near the horses. The animals startled, raising their heads. Ethan threw another stone, making them more restless. The men at the fire looked up, confused. "What was that?" one of them said, standing. Before they could investigate, Ethan stepped on a dry branch deliberately. The snap echoed across the camp. The horses panicked, pulling hard against their ropes. One broke free, then another. Soon all three were running wildly in different directions, kicking dust everywhere. The men shouted in frustration, chasing after the horses. Ethan motioned quickly to the Apache women. "Now!" he whispered. They darted toward the goods. The younger woman grabbed the medicine chest while the older one helped steady it. Ethan stayed hidden, calling out from different spots low, quick sounds that made it seem like several people were hiding around the ridge. The men, already confused and angry, yelled in all directions without knowing where the voices came from. By the time they realized the chest was gone, Ethan and the women were slipping back behind the hills, moving fast and silent. When they reached a safe distance, they finally stopped. The younger woman hugged the chest tightly, tears welling in her eyes. The older woman touched Ethan's arm gently, not as a healer this time, but in gratitude. "You saved more than our horse today," she said softly. "You saved our people's hope." Ethan looked toward the fading light, breathing hard but steady. He felt something warm spread through his chest. Not pride, but a feeling he had not known for years. He felt connected, needed, part of something larger than his lonely ranch. And as the three of them began the journey back toward the Apache settlement, Ethan realized that this day had changed him more than he understood. He wasn't just a lone cowboy anymore. He had become part of a story he never expected to enter. The sun was slipping lower as Ethan and the two Apache women moved through the rough land with the medicine chest held tightly between them. The warm light stretched long shadows across the hills, wrapping the world in a soft golden glow. Even with the chest safely in their hands, no one relaxed fully. The men they had outsmarted could return at any moment, and the journey back to the settlement was still long. But the women walked with quicker steps now, filled with fresh energy. The weight in their hearts had lifted. Ethan stayed alert, glancing behind them every few minutes. He had seen enough trouble in life to know that desperate men did not give up easily. Still, he felt calm. The land around him was familiar now. Even the edges of the hills that marked the border of his ranch. This was the place he knew best. The place where he belonged. And now, for once, he wasn't riding it alone. The younger woman walked beside him, holding the chest firmly against her side. "My mother will be relieved," she said quietly. "She is one of the healers. Without this, she could not help our sick ones tonight." Ethan nodded. "Then we bring it to her fast." The older woman walked on his other side, her eyes scanning the land with the sharpness of someone who grew up in open country. "We must be careful," she said. "The men may try to follow their stolen goods. They may blame us when they see their horses gone." Ethan almost smiled at that. "They won't be riding fast anytime soon," he said. "Those horses were spooked good." 70. The younger woman gave a small laugh, soft, but the first real laugh he had heard from her. "You fooled them well," she said. "Your voice. You made it sound like many people were hiding." Ethan shrugged. "Life alone teaches a man how to use the land." She studied him for a moment. "You have been alone for a long time." It wasn't a question. Ethan didn't deny it. They walked in silence for a while, the sky slowly turning from gold to dusky purple. A breeze picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of distant smoke from their campfire earlier. Ethan felt the air change, cooler now. Night would arrive soon, bringing darkness that made even simple paths dangerous. As the first stars appeared, they reached a narrow pass between two tall ridges. The older woman stopped and held up a hand. "We rest for a moment," she said softly. "The land becomes tricky ahead. We cross carefully." Ethan agreed and sat on a smooth rock. His arm throbbed dully beneath the bandage, reminding him of the scrape from earlier. He didn't complain. He had worked through worse injuries back on the ranch, alone and without help. But now, as he rested in the shadow of the ridge, he felt strangely grateful. Not for the pain, but for the company. The younger woman opened her flask and offered him water. He accepted, taking only a small sip before handing it back. She noticed how he avoided drinking too much. "You could take more," she said gently. Ethan shook his head. "Water is precious out here. You need it more than I do." She looked at him with quiet understanding. For a long time, she had believed cowboys were loud, impatient men who cared only for themselves. But Ethan was different, patient in danger, soft-spoken in fear, willing to give even when he had little. The older woman broke the silence as she examined the path ahead. "We must continue soon. The tribe will worry, and the dangerous men may wake more from their confusion." Ethan stood and dusted off his clothes. "Then let's move." They started down the narrow path, walking single file because the trail was too tight for side-by-side steps. Ethan walked behind them, ready to steady the younger woman if she slipped on the uneven ground. The rocks crumbled easily here, and the wind whistled through the cracks in low, eerie tones. Halfway through the pass, Ethan paused again. He listened. Something in the wind felt different, an echo, a distant rumble of hooves. He motioned quickly for the women to stop. "What is it?" the older woman whispered. Ethan tilted his head. At first, he wasn't sure. But then it came again, a faint but familiar rhythm of horses being driven fast across dry soil. "They found one of their horses," he said quietly. "Maybe two." Fear flashed across the younger woman's face. "Are they coming this way?" Ethan looked around. The ridge walls around them were steep, making it almost impossible to climb out without slipping. The trail behind them was long and narrow. If the men came from that direction, they would see them instantly. "They might follow the tracks," he said. "And our path is straight." The older woman clenched her jaw. "We must hurry," but Ethan shook his head. "If we run, they will hear us. And if they hear us, they will come faster." "So what do we do?" the younger woman asked. Ethan scanned the rocky walls. There, a small hollow, half hidden behind a cluster of shrubs. It wasn't deep, but it might be enough to hide them if they stayed still. He motioned toward it. "In there. Quiet." The women moved quickly, slipping into the hollow while Ethan checked the trail one more time. Then he joined them and crouched low. The chest lay between them, wrapped in the older woman's arms. The sound of hooves grew clearer, closer. Ethan felt his heartbeat slow. Not from fear, but from focus. The women breathed quietly beside him, trying not to make even the smallest noise. The hollow was tight, and their shoulders brushed slightly, but they stayed perfectly still. Moments later, two riders emerged at the entrance of the pass. They shouted to each other, sounding angry and frustrated. The riders scanned the ground, searching for any sign of the stolen chest. One man dismounted and inspected the earth. Ethan held his breath. The rider kicked a stone angrily, then mounted again. "Tracks end here," the man growled. "Someone help them. Let them run," the other said bitterly. "We will find them later. We know these hills better than any cowboy." Their horses turned sharply, heading farther down the hills. The sound of hooves slowly faded until nothing remained but the whisper of the wind. The women exhaled softly, their bodies trembling from the close call. "They almost found us," the younger woman whispered. Ethan gave a small nod. "But they didn't." The older woman clasped his hand briefly in silent gratitude before letting go. It was a gesture of trust, a gesture most outsiders never received. When the sound of hooves was completely gone, they slipped out of the hollow and continued forward, careful but determined. Soon the ridge opened into a wider plain, and in the distance, a faint glow rose into the sky, the Apache settlement's fires burning in the early night. "There," the younger woman said, her voice filled with relief. Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction in his chest. He had promised to help them return safely. And now they were close. As they descended the final slope, the women walked faster, almost running. Ethan watched them, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't used to this feeling, being part of something that mattered to other people. He wasn't used to being welcomed anywhere. But as the lights of the settlement grew brighter, spilling across the land like warm lanterns of hope, he felt something change inside him. The loneliness that had clung to him for years loosened its grip. At that moment, he realized he wasn't just guiding them home. He was finding a place where he belonged, at least for tonight. When Ethan and the two Apache women left the narrow pass behind them, the land slowly opened into a wide valley. The faint glow that marked the Apache settlement shimmered like a cluster of tiny stars resting on the earth. The night air was cool now, carrying a gentle breeze that brushed across their faces, bringing with it distant sounds of fire crackling and soft singing from the village. The two women quickened their steps, the medicine chest held carefully between them. It was not heavy, but its importance made it feel like the most precious thing in the world. Ethan followed a few steps behind, watching them, feeling something warm inside him. He had helped people before, but never like this. This felt different, bigger, meaningful. As they approached the settlement, shapes began to appear through the darkness. Tall, wooden poles, small fires glowing in circles, and silhouettes of people walking between their homes. Soon murmurs rose from the villagers as they noticed the returning women. Some rushed forward, eyes wide with worry that quickly turned into confusion when they saw the quiet rancher walking behind them. The first person to reach them was an elderly healer, her hair streaked with silver, her face lined with years of wisdom. When she saw the medicine chest, her breath caught. She touched it gently with trembling hands, as if needing confirmation that it was truly back. Then she looked at Ethan, this stranger from another world, and her eyes softened with gratitude that words could barely express. The younger woman spoke quickly to her, explaining everything that had happened. Ethan couldn't understand all their words, but he understood their expressions. Fear, relief, respect. As the healer listened, she looked repeatedly toward Ethan with growing wonder, as if she could not believe a lone cowboy had risked so much for people he barely knew. More villagers gathered, forming a wide circle around them. Parents brought their children close, elders leaned forward with keen attention, and warriors stood with arms crossed, studying Ethan carefully. They expected conflict whenever a cowboy came near their land. But this night was different. The older woman stepped forward and raised the medicine chest above her head. A quiet murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. She placed the chest in the healer's arms and said something in her language that made the healer nod and press the box to her heart. Then the older woman turned to Ethan. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking, choosing her words carefully so he could understand. "You saved our horse," she said softly. "And you saved our people's medicine. You walked with us through danger when you could have turned away." Ethan shook his head slightly. "I only did what anyone should do." But the younger woman stepped closer, her voice firm. "No," she said. "Not anyone. You did." Ethan didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to receiving praise. He wasn't used to being the center of attention at all. The villagers continued to stare at him, not with fear, not with suspicion, but with something he never expected: respect. The healer moved toward him and gently touched his wrapped arm, the one the older woman had treated earlier. "You were hurt helping us," she said in a careful, warm tone. "We will help you too." Ethan started to protest, but the healer motioned for him to sit by the fire. The villagers made space for him, and he found himself surrounded by people who only hours earlier did not know he existed. Children peeked from behind their parents, whispering to each other about the cowboy who had saved their medicines. The healer cleaned his arm again, applying fresh herbs and tying a new bandage with steady hands. As she worked, she began to speak in soft tones. Though Ethan couldn't understand most of her words, her kindness spoke clearly. When she finished, the older woman placed a small wooden bowl in Ethan's hands, warm broth filled with herbs and vegetables. He hesitated, but she insisted. "You helped us," she said. "Now we take care of you." Ethan took a slow sip. The broth was simple but comforting, warming him from the inside. As he ate, villagers began to settle around the fire. Some brought blankets for the women who had traveled with him. Others spread food across shared baskets. The flames flickered across their faces, lighting the night with a gentle glow. After a while, an elder approached, tall, serious, with deep lines around his eyes that showed a lifetime of watching both peace and conflict. He stood near Ethan, studying him in silence. Ethan stood as well, unsure what to expect. The elder finally spoke. "Many cowboys come through our land," he said slowly. "Some bring trouble. Some bring nothing. But very few bring a heart like yours." Ethan bowed his head slightly. "I wasn't looking for trouble," he said. The elder smiled faintly. "Yet trouble found you. And you answered it with courage." He reached into the blanket wrapped around his shoulders and pulled out a small object, a necklace made of thin, braided rope with a carved wooden pendant shaped like a leaf. He held it out to Ethan. "This is a sign of trust," the elder said, "not given to many outside our tribe. When you wear it, you are welcome here. You are not a stranger." Ethan stared at the necklace, stunned. He had never expected anything like this. He took it slowly, feeling the smoothness of the wood against his fingertips. "Thank you," he said, his voice catching slightly. I don't know what to say." The elder placed a hand on his shoulder. "You already said enough with your actions." As the night continued, the villagers told stories around the fire. Stories of seasons past, of hunts, of storms survived, of kindness shown to those in need. Ethan listened quietly, feeling something he had long forgotten, a sense of belonging. The warmth of the fire, the sound of soft laughter, the presence of people who accepted him, everything felt strangely peaceful. Eventually, the younger woman sat beside him. She looked at him with a grateful smile. "You will always be welcome here," she said. "You helped us when we needed it most." Ethan felt a gentle ache in his chest, not pain, but a deep warmth. He had lived alone for so long that he had stopped expecting connection. Yet here, among people he had just met, he felt more seen than he had in years. As the fire burned low, Ethan rose to leave. He had a long ride back to his ranch. And the night was getting colder. The villagers stood as he prepared his horse. The older woman approached, placing her hand over her heart, then extending it toward him, a gesture of respect. "Thank you, cowboy," she said softly. The younger woman added, "You were lonely today, but now, you are not." Ethan swallowed, touched by her words. "If you ever need help again," he said, "you know where my ranch is." They nodded. The healer whispered a blessing over him as he mounted his horse. As Ethan rode away, the necklace hung gently against his chest, tapping lightly with each movement of the horse. Behind him, the fires of the Apache settlement glowed like warm stars, lighting the valley with a quiet promise. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the land around him was not empty. It felt alive, connected, filled with people who now knew his name, his actions, and his heart. And as he rode into the wide, peaceful night, he realized something simple but powerful. He was no longer just a lonely rancher. He was part of something bigger, something good.